So I'm going to continue talking about basically building the relationship between the practitioner, whether they're internal and external, and the actual client. So those are the decision makers that are actually driving the change in the organization, and usually the organizational decision makers themselves. We're also going to talk about several models to help you conceptualize kind of how this process plays out. And really the take-home message of this particular part of my lectures is to kind of focus on that there is an enormous amount of variables that go into how successful the relationship between the actual client and the practitioner is. And that we're going to try to at least conceptualize that, talk about some models to help you conceptualize that, and to recognize that these are important steps in the actual success of OD practicing. So I open up with just a simple model of practitioner skill profile. And this also is just kind of a reminder that practitioner has got a pretty hefty job in front of them. They're having to coordinate activities. They're having to basically be miniature organizational scientists trying to gather information about the culture, whether the organization is ready for change. They need to identify who are the key stakeholders, both those driving the change and those that will implement the change. They need to create and implement a organizational change program and intervention. They need to manage that. They also need to be collecting data of what was the problem like prior to the intervention, what is it like after. That's a lot of information and a lot of processes and a lot of skill sets to draw from. And finally, one of their prime jobs is to actually communicate and sell the need for this change. So a practitioner's skill profile involves leadership skills. Though the practitioner themselves will not become managers, they hopefully will not be making actual leadership decisions. They are having to actually direct interventions in a way that actually sticks with an organization. They are going to need some authority, and they are going to need to be able to come from a position of some form of leadership. They're going to need pretty major project management skills to identify creating an actual planned intervention on a timeline with implementation schedules, and again, identifying who these interventions are targeting and who will be the ones actually implementing these interventions. Strong communication skills, so the ability to actually explain the models that we're talking about in this class to the decision makers, to be able to sell the need for OD, the ability to sell various interventions as the right solution to a problem. Problem solving skills, so the ability to actually look at an organization from a broader viewpoint, from, if you will, a more external viewpoint, looking at it from an open systems model framework, for instance, and looking for where are the problems and how do we solve them? What tools are going to work here to make the organization better? Interpersonal skills, so basically their ability to build trust, their ability to actually communicate their other skill sets in a way that people are willing to follow their lead, and just general personal skills, kind of a combination of all of those other elements that might be involved in trying to do the job that is set in front of them as an organizational development practitioner. So the first model I want to kind of think about is just, again, the process of forming that practitioner-client relationship. We're on step 2 of the 5-step model to recognize that not only is an organization an open system of interacting elements, that the practitioner themselves and their OD intervention are often best thought of as an external or at least externally driven intervention within that organization. So in this model, we're basically looking at the organizational system itself. So think of it in the open system model. We're not necessarily looking at inputs and outputs. We're not looking at the feedback or the environment. Just within the organization itself, in the center of that organization is going to be the actual client sponsors. So think of that as the center of a cell or the brain of an organism that's making the decisions, that's decided we need an organizational development change. We need to change how this organization functions. And then moving towards the external of the organization, we have the next step is the client sponsoring an OD program goal. So they come up with what is the problem, what needs to be changed, not necessarily the interventions themselves, but what's the problem that needs to be addressed. We then have the internal practitioners, if they are there. This could also be considered to be where a lot of the actual management that will intervene and actually do the interventions will be. And then often at the very external part of that organization is going to be the external practitioner, currently a part of the organizational system, but also still with a foot outside the organization and eventually will be once again outside that organization. So we have these spheres, if you will, going from left to right of the most integral part of the organization, the actual client decision makers, that the goals of this intervention are not going to necessarily be central generally. And what that represents is the fact that rarely are we looking at an intervention that affects the entire organization. We're usually looking at an intervention that affects parts of the organization, which means the goals of the intervention are not necessarily going to be central to the organization itself. And then the intervention of the actual implementation of the intervention that's going to try to address those goals is going to be further removed from the center of the organization. The two ovals, client target B, client target A, those are the actual interventions. And notice that they interact with all of those parts. They should be driven by the goals. They definitely will be interacted with by the practitioners, but they're still also being guided by that original sponsor or decision maker. So again, when we think about forming the practitioner-client relationship, we're needing to think about who are the practitioners, who are the clients, in other words, decision makers they're contacting with, and then what are the client target systems? So who in the organization is being targeted and what do those interventions look like? So building those relationships is what we're really focusing on, is that if the practitioners are being connected to the actual client decision makers and the people actually implementing it kind of peripherally sometimes. So they're a part of the process, but they're not necessarily the decision making driving the process, and they're not necessarily the people actually implementing the interventions. It is important for the practitioner, whether internal or external, to give some thought to how they're being perceived and whether they're being successful in their role of being a leader, a project manager, and a clear communicator of the need of this intervention. And because of that, I want to talk a little bit about the initial intervention is the actual evaluation by both the client, in this case the decision makers driving the OD intervention, and the practitioners of each other. And first impressions are important. So we're needing to create a relationship with all of the elements, the people we're working with directly and the people that are actually driving the change based on mutual trust and openness. So what one perceives can often be different from reality. People behave on the basis of what they perceive versus what really is. A good example of this is I once had 3 graduate students that were in conflict. And it was definitely a she said, she said, she said situation. All 3 of them were coming to me at different times with their side of the story. And at some point, I finally sat down with one of the 3 and said, what I really want to talk about right now is the perception of reality, not the reality. And I told her, I am going to give you 100% the benefit of the doubt that your side of the story is the truth. I don't know that for a fact, and in fact, I have conflicting information. But let's assume that that is the case, that you are 100% in the right, and your version of what has happened between you and these 2 other students is the truth. The problem is that's not what they're perceiving, and of the 3 of you, you're the one whose productivity has dropped. So on a perception versus reality, you've got a perceptional problem that you need to change how people are perceiving your actions and make sure that if your side is the truth, that that's what people are understanding. And you need your outcomes to also back up that perception of your reality. Now, that might sound a little callous to you, and I could obviously go into more details. But the point is it's a good illustration, again, that reality is often, we hope that reality and perception are the same. And it's what we strive for. But we also need to not go forward in any relationship assuming that just because we know what the reality is, that's what other people are perceiving the reality. And this is especially important for OD because in organizational development situations, when we're doing an intervention, we have a lot of specialized knowledge into why this is the best plan. We need to be very careful that we're not assuming that we don't need to constantly sell. In other words, convince people that their perception of what we're doing is matching the reality of the value of what we're doing. A lot of people are going to have reactions to it. A lot of people are going to react poorly to change. So one of our biggest jobs is to be a salesman for what we're doing. So this is a pretty complex model, and I really don't want to get way too into it, but basically the purpose of this model is to just make you realize how much goes into someone forming perceptions. So whenever we have an interaction with someone, what's actually happening in the perception formation block, so that center block, is we have actual perception of the event. So I'm meeting someone for the first time and we're exchanging information. So something that's going to happen in that process is I'm going to be interpreting the events. So whatever is said by the person, I have to decide, did they say that in a funny way? Did they say that in a sarcastic way? Did they say that in a confident way? And then from that, I'm going to start making my perceptions. We're going to start being also, once I've made an interpretation, I'm going to be a little more selective. So let's say the first interaction I have with someone, I decide they're being snarky. Now, again, that may not be the reality. That's my perception. At that point, I'm going to start being more selective in what I attend to. So if the next three sentences they say are very tonally balanced, there's nothing to really draw information from, I'm going to ignore those because they're not playing into my interpretation, this person is snarky. But if their fourth sentence also has a little bit of an edge to it, I'm going to focus on that again. I'm being selective to reinforce my interpretation, this person is snarky. So as that moves forward, I'm going to keep making those interpretations. I'm going to keep selectively looking for more information that backs my initial perception, my first perception, and eventually I'm going to hit closure. And closure means I'm no longer taking in more information. I've formed my perception. And then that perception is going to color that relationship. So this is, in a microcosm, an example of why that saying, first impressions matter, really does. We only have a few chances right off the bat to make sure that someone is interpreting what we're telling them in a positive way. So how can we actually think about how do we present ourselves to someone on a first meeting, especially if we're an OD professional and we're meeting either with a client decision maker or someone that we're going to have to trust to actually implement our changes in the organization? Well, some of the things that go into that first interpretation is past experiences. So, do we know if they've had OD successes in the past? Have they had positive experiences with external practitioners? That's some information we might want to try to get a hold of. We may want to ask some questions about what is your previous experiences with OD? Because if I know they've been primarily positive and the company is very open to OD, that's going to change a little bit how I open up with that initial contact, that initial conversation, because I can kind of hope that that interpretation is going to be a positive one. But if I find out I'm the third person they've brought in to try to handle this problem and the last two ended in failure, they're going to be looking for evidence that I'm going to be the next failure. So I'm going to have it, it's going to be incumbent on me to really push forward how I'm going to be different in that situation. So what information they have about me, organizational position and job reward systems, stress and group pressure, interaction and the role, all of these are going to interplay. So it's one of the reasons why, as an external practitioner, I often have students in our program, we're a terminal master's program, ask, can I be an external consultant with a master's degree? And the answer is yes, you can, without a question. However, if you're an external consultant, you're coming in to these initial confrontations with not a lot of information and being able to put that doctor. So I'm not an OD professional, it's Dr. Nadler or Dr. Nadler or Joel Nadler, PhD. That sets my role as an expert at a little higher level, which makes those initial interpretation and initial first concept perception formations a little easier for me to manage. And a lot of organizations that specialize in external consulting often tend to hire people with PhDs as their lead consultants to kind of fast track this process. So again, this is a fairly complex model. It's just really here to kind of reiterate that idea that we want to really recognize that from first contact on, we are trying to build up positive, trustful relationships with everyone involved in the OD process. And that if we're failing at that, the chances of the OD being successful is greatly diminished. So dilemma interactions, during this interaction, as the OD professional, external or internal, is actually having the initial meetings with clients, we're also wanting to analyze that situation as well. And we're wanting to look for some red flags. We definitely want to ask the question our clients on their definitions of their problem. Basically, this is do they actually understand what the problem is, and do they have a clear conception of how that problem could be fixed, or what needs to change to represent that problem has been solved? We want to make sure that the client is aware for a need to change and is a willingness. So there often can be a client who's talking OD, but they're really reluctant to actually move on any of these changes. So this is, again, something we're trying to gauge. We also want to make sure the client doesn't have unrealistic expectations. Not thinking, wow, if I turn my company over to this OD specialist in 6 months, we're going to be a market dominant position. We also want to be very careful to see how likely the client is to misuse their power. And what I really mean by that is they have power to use in an organization. Generally speaking, we're dealing with the top levels of management in an organization that has reward power, has punishment power, can terminate individuals. The problem here is that good OD is usually aimed at both increasing the productivity or reducing problems in the organization, but also making the organization a more open and positive one on the social aspects or the opinion aspects of the employees. And if we have a client that is wanting to misuse their power in order to force change, it's going to be very hard for us to not find ourselves in an organizational transformation situation, not an organizational development situation. And we also want to make sure that they're valuing the differences between the client and practitioner. They recognize the difference between their role and ours. So this kind of leads us to another model to kind of just conceptualize this process. The practitioner style model basically focuses on the practitioners bringing knowledge, skills, values, and experiences. The client system has its own subcultures and its readiness to change, and these together determine exactly what kind of approach is going to work best. So we're bringing in our knowledge, skills, and experiences, and we're going to be creating task, performance expectations, rewards that we want to use to create change. Within the system, the decision makers or clients, they have their own expectations of what they expect from this process, their own values of how they use their power, and what they conceive as positive interventions that they would approve, and also their readiness to change. And the two of these basically combine to find out whether an organization is really going to react positively to an OD intervention. So I keep coming back to this idea of we need to first decide, do we need to create the climate for change? In other words, is our first intervention really focusing at building that trust in stage 2 with the actual client or decision makers, and also is one of our first major tasks to help sell the need for change in the first place. And one of the ways we can also do this is helping to create a climate of change through basically role modeling or practicing what we're preaching. So if we're preaching interventions that are going to increase the trust, authenticity, openness, and engagement of our employees, we need to make sure that we're communicating in our own process with both the people, the boots on the ground, creating the intervention, or not creating it, but implementing it, and the decision makers, that same sense of openness, authenticity, and trust. So here's another model that basically just kind of helps to try to conceptualize what's going on in this initial phase. And again, it's a 2x2 model, and it really represents the acceptance of personal responsibility within an organization and the openness to others to share thoughts and feelings. And this is really more of kind of how the practitioner-client relationship is going to happen when there is an agreement in these. So this is kind of a two-part model, that when we have a high level of personal responsibility, so in other words, personal responsibility on the point of the client and the practitioner, but also an openness to share other ideas, we're usually going to be in a consensus model. There's an acceptance of responsibility, there's an openness to new ideas, and this is really what we're wanting to move towards. This is the ideal situation for OD, because this represents a culture that accepts responsibilities for one's actions, but also is open to the thoughts of others. If there's a high focus on open to others, but a low acceptance of responsibility, we're kind of in a charismatic relationship. In other words, the change is being driven almost completely by an openness to others, but there's also a low level of responsibility or an acceptance of what's going on. We also have gamesmanship, so a low openness to others, but a high acceptance of personal responsibility. This is usually a more political or toxic environment where each person is trying to game the system for their own value. In other words, they recognize I'm responsible for my own actions, but I'm not really open to those of others. And finally, we have the apathetic relationship, closed to others and rejects responsibility. So this is just another two things you can kind of do a mental game of, is as you're creating that practitioner-client relationship, ask yourself, does it seem like that I'm taking on responsibility and that the client is also willing to accept their own responsibility in the need for change? And are the interventions we're talking about really being open to the thoughts of others and to basically bringing in a more engaged workforce? If so, we're in a good situation. We're in a consensus situation. If we find ourselves in one of these other situations, we want to ask ourselves, is our first intervention needing to kind of address the fact that we're not in the ideal situation to move forward on any other intervention? As we end up this process of phase two, where we're actually building this relationship, we want to formalize the operating ground rules. So obligations and contract advisable, especially for our external practitioner. But who is the point of contact? What is the role of the practitioner? What is the role of the client or decision makers? What will be the fees or bonuses? What's the timetable and schedule? What are the anticipated results? What are the operating ground rules? And this is a good idea for both internal or external. So this is where we're actually fully explicitly stating what is the role of this entire process. What does this intervention look like, and how will problems be handled? What are the points of contact? And all of these are worth considering to, again, provide a basis to where there's going to be an open level of communication and a trust-built relationship.